Ladies and gentlemen, hello from Tehran, the capital of Iran, where protests and also American threats and Iranian warning. This interview from Tehran, we are hosting the Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi. Excellencies, welcome to Al Jazeera. Thank you. Doctor, now there are protests in Iran. It started out of the blue and suddenly, and it evolved into conflicts and confrontations. What is your comment, and what are the reasons, especially that this is not the first time we see protests in Iran? The recurrence of protests and demonstrations in Iran is not something unusual. In any system based on democracy, the right to peaceful protest is guaranteed. The Iranian constitution explicitly refers to this right. Therefore, the expression by the people of their views, grievances, and objections through demonstrations and gathering is acceptable in principle. However, what we are facing this time is entirely different. In my view, these protests and the acts of rioting that followed them can be divided into two phases. The first phase was from December 28, 2025 to January 7, 2026, during which the demonstrations were entirely peaceful and aimed at expressing grievances and protests. At times, some violence occurred during these demonstrations, which is a natural matter. The government dealt rationally with these protests. President Masoud Pezeshkian entered into a dialogue with members of the Chamber of Commerce and business leaders and economic activists. He listened to their views and ideas and sought to resolve their problems. Some economic proposals and plans emerged from these discussions. Also, representatives of traders, economists, and professionals were also invited to a meeting of the Iranian government, and dialogue took place with them. There was a positive trajectory despite the presence of some acts of violence. Iranian police and security forces were unarmed and were present at the demonstrations to ensure that the level of violence did not exceed what is customary. During this period, there were no fatalities, only some injuries. From January 8 to January 10, a very important development occurred, which was terrorist elements who entered the scene. What I'm saying here is based on documents and evidence. Some of this evidence has been referred to, and some will be announced later. The terrorist cells were organized and trained and entered the crowds of demonstrators with weapons. We suddenly faced individuals among the demonstrations who possessed weapons and were firing at police and security forces. More importantly and more strangely, they were also firing at the demonstrators themselves and sought to increase the number of deaths. This was a strange phenomenon. These elements entered the demonstrations with the aim of increasing the number of victims. Why was this their objective? I believe that this was due to the statements of the U.S. President when he said that if Iran fired on demonstrators, the United States would intervene. We did not fire on the demonstrators, but those with malicious plans, and I believe they were directed from outside, had organized these plans abroad and implemented them through their agents inside the countries. They sought to increase the number of deaths in order to force the U.S. President to intervene in these confrontations. Therefore, the objective was clear. They began firing at police and security forces and even at demonstrators. Terrorist elements fired from behind, causing a large number of fatalities during these events. Another number of victims were killed by stones and sticks, unfortunately. After that, another important development occurred, the creation of terror. This was strange and something we have not seen except in the behavior of ISIL and similar groups. Some people were buried alive. Terrorist elements also burned some police officers protesters alive and beheaded them. This has no connection whatsoever with the Iranian culture. They also burned mosques. It is impossible for an Iranian to burn a mosque because our culture does not permit such acts. The terrorists also finished off the wounded by shooting them. They likewise burned public places and burned also private property. Doctor, there are those who are criticizing the security behavior of Iran. If Iran does recognize the right of the protesters and the right to protest, why did you cut internet and communication? How would you justify this? The internet network was cut after the terrorist operations began. The internet was not cut off before that. We officially acknowledged the protest, and the government was in a state of dialogue with the protesters. Representatives of the protesters were invited to the government, and the Iranian president himself met with them. The internet was cut not only after we confronted terrorist operations and realized that orders were coming from outside. Some communications were recorded. We have recorded voices of individuals giving orders from abroad to terrorist agents, instructing them to fire at police forces and demonstrators if police forces were not there. Their intention was to spread killing. This went beyond the state of normal protest. From our perspective, January 8 was the 13th day of the American-Israeli war against us. The recent war lasted 12 days, and January 8 was the 13th day of that war. What the enemy failed to achieve in that war, it sought to achieve here in another way by steering tension within Iranian society. Therefore, our security forces had to intervene and make the decision to cut internet. For this reason, the communications of those terrorist groups had to be cut and coordination among them had to be prevented, which was achieved with God's help. After 3 days, the situation came under control. A major portion of those terrorist agents were arrested, and we have their confessions, including the amounts of money they received. For example, they received a specific amount for attacking a police headquarters, another amount for setting vehicles on fire, and other amounts for other acts. All of these confessions are clear and documented. Accordingly, January 8 should be considered an extension of the 12-day war. From January 10 until now, we have witnessed control over the situation, thank God. The country is now experiencing calm. At the same time, the government remains determined to fully respond to the demands of the people and the protesters. Nevertheless, we will not abandon the rights of our people that were violated by agents linked to foreign actors, and we will not tolerate this, neither with regard to the blood of the victims. Doctor, there is a change or a shift in the behavior or the stance of Iran. First, it was legitimate protests, and then it was vandalization. And yesterday, we have heard from President Pezeshkian, and today, when Your Excellency spoke with embassies, you were using the term of terrorists and ISIL. Does this mean that Iran is trying to shift its security policy when it comes to dealing with protesters from containing to arresting? No. Our policy has always been consistent. We pursue a soft policy in dealing with protests. We tolerate protesters and listen to them. But when it comes to terrorism, our policy is decisive. We will never allow terrorist agents and terrorist groups, especially those managed from abroad, and particularly Israel, to continue their actions. If you follow Israeli media, they repeatedly stated that the situation in Iran was under Israel's control and that its agents were moving among the protesters and speaking Persian. More importantly, there was a tweet written by Pompeo, the former U.S. Secretary of State and former head of the CIA during the Trump administration. He tweeted that he congratulates all Iranians and the Mossad agents marching alongside them. Is there any clearer admission than that? This indicates that Mossad was seeking to bring its terrorist agents into Iran. Where did the weapons that were brought in come from? Weapons were distributed among the protesters and terror and fear were spread. This phenomenon is completely different from ordinary protests. We saw how a woman was killed by police in the United States several days ago. She was sitting in her car. She was an American mother of 3 children and was killed by U.S. police at a very short distance. The U.S. president said that the police were acting in self-defense. The U.S. Department of Homeland Security issued a statement saying that anyone who attacks the police will face severe consequences. Attacking the police is unacceptable anywhere in the world, especially when police forces are fired upon. In this case, this is not about protests or demonstrations, but a terrorist act. We have video footage documenting the shooting. There is a clear difference between this and protest. The Iranian people are dear to us and have preserved their unity as they demonstrated during the 12-day war. And again now, we have seen the marches that took place across the country in which everyone once again gathered around the Iranian flag. We will continue along this path, but we will not tolerate terrorism. Doctor, do you believe that these demonstrators are reflecting a popular pressure because of the economic situation? Do you think this will exert a pressure on Iran and the Foreign Ministry of Iran in order to shift more quickly into negotiations with the U.S. that is now pending? Doctor, there was an embargo, a scoop saying that there was a upcoming meeting with between Witkoff and yourself. Do you think that there will be this meeting will take place, and do you think that this internal and domestic pressure will push Iran to the table of negotiations? The communications between Mr. Witkoff and me are ongoing and existed prior to these protests and have continued for some time. During the days before the protests and after them, our contacts have remained continuous. Some ideas have also been put forward and are being studied by us. We have never fled negotiations. However, negotiations must be fair and just based on mutual interest, not on the expectations that one side obtains all the benefits. Negotiations must be based on mutual respect and without threats. Is there a possibility of a meeting? Do you expect any meeting anytime soon with Witkoff? As I said, there are ideas being proposed right now, but alongside these proposals, some threats are being issued, and negotiations and threats cannot be combined. If we reach a point of negotiation without threats or dictates, and on the basis of mutual respect and reciprocal interest in the nuclear file, we will be present at the nuclear negotiation table. However, so far, we are not convinced that the United States is seeking this path, unfortunately. We have a bad history of negotiations with the United States. You remember the nuclear agreement and how they withdrew from it. Last year, we were negotiating when our country was targeted, and the activation of the snapback mechanism occurred while we were in the midst of the negotiations. From our perspective, the United States is not ready for fair and balanced negotiations. If matters move towards such a point, we will study the issue. In my view, fair negotiations are based on a process of just exchange. We have previously demonstrated that we are ready to build confidence regarding our nuclear program. We have never sought to acquire a nuclear weapon, nor do we seek to do so. If we had wanted to obtain a nuclear weapon, we would have have sufficient justifications to do so. But our policy is a principle one. We believe these weapons are inhumane and forbidden based on the fatwa of the Supreme Leader. We will not relinquish our rights to the peaceful use of nuclear energy, including enrichment, as a committed member of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. We will not give up this right. However, if anyone has questions or concerns, we are ready to address them in order to build confidence. In return, we expect our rights to be respected or recognized and for sanctions to be lifted. In my view, a fair agreement can be reached if unreasonable demands are not put forward. If excessive demands are raised or files are introduced that we cannot negotiate over, the matter will become complicated and negotiations will not be possible. Our positions are clear. If we feel that the interests of our people can be achieved through negotiations, we will not hesitate. However, we have not reached that conviction as of yet. Do you expect that there will be any U.S. measure, whether military or otherwise, before negotiations, especially that we heard from the U.S. administrations that before negotiations the United States could take any measure? We are ready for any action. If they want to test military action, which they tested once and achieved no result, we are ready for that. We now enjoy a higher level of readiness, both qualitatively and quantitatively, compared to before the 12-day war. We are prepared for all options. If they want to test any option, including the diplomatic option, it must be under the conditions I mentioned. What matters is the extent to which a wise approach is adopted. Unfortunately, there are those who seek to drag the United States into war and endless wars in order to achieve Israel's interest. We must see to what extent the United States chooses to move along the path of wisdom. Last question. What is your comment regarding the summit that the President will convene to discuss the protest? What do you think the options that will be on the table, and how would you deal with these options? I don't know. However, as I said, we are prepared for all options, and I hope they choose wisely and pay attention to those who seek to drag the United States into paths they desire and to attempts to deceive Washington. From our perspective, it does not matter which option is chosen. We are prepared for war, diplomacy, and economic options. We have lived under sanctions for many years. We will take any measure to lift sanctions. But we can also live with sanctions if conditions for lifting them are not available. On this basis, we are prepared for all options, but we hope that wisdom prevails. Dr. Abbas Araghchi, thank you very much for being with us at Al Jazeera. Ladies and gentlemen, this was the interview from Tehran with the head of the diplomacy of Iran, Abbas Araghchi. Thank you and see you.
Don't miss out. Get a full picture. Subscribe to Al Jazeera for reliable news, expert insight. Like, share, stay ahead.